C.S. Lewis is one of those rare Christians who is loved across denominational divides. Everyone likes him. I mean, you can find everyone from Low Church Baptists to Eastern Orthodox to Catholics and even non-Christians enjoying his works, which range from poetry to fiction to some incredibly rich devotional material. There's good reason for this wide appeal, of course. In addition to just being like a super talented writer, he intentionally wrote in such a way as to appeal beyond his own tradition by pointing people to the heart of the Christian faith that is shared by all who claim Jesus as Lord and Savior. Nowhere is this more clear than in his most enduring work, Mere Christianity. And in the preface to that, he writes, "The reader should be warned that I offer no help to anyone who is hesitating between two Christian denominations. Ever since I became a Christian, I have thought that the best, perhaps the only service I could do for my unbelieving neighbors was to explain and defend the belief that has been common to nearly all Christians at all times." This doesn't just ring true in that book, but it really is a consistent theme across all of his work. However, C.S. Lewis' broad appeal shouldn't be mistaken for him not having any views of his own or that he somehow was equally a part of all these traditions. In other words, he wasn't like an amorphous universal Christian. He was an Anglican, a tradition that is perhaps fitting for a man that can reach across denominational divides since it is often self-consciously trying to be a via media or middle way between Protestantism and Catholicism. Nevertheless, Lewis' Anglicanism has been puzzling to some people, including Lewis' own friends. Famously, it was JRR Tolkien who helped lead Lewis to the Christian faith. And it was a matter of some frustration for the great Catholic writer of The Lord of the Rings that Lewis did not himself become Catholic. It wasn't only Tolkien that thought this, though. Rumors often floated in his own lifetime that he was sure to become Catholic. There's a really entertaining example of this that comes to us in the form of a letter written by Lewis' wife, Joy Davidman, who was responding to her ex-husband after he'd written her saying that he'd heard Lewis had become Roman Catholic. She responded, "Lord, no. Jack is about as likely to turn Roman Catholic as I am to be made Pope. That canard is a hardy perennial. The Romans always indulge in wishful thinking about anyone who has theological influence. But Jack isn't even high church. He's a tough Ulsterman, after all, half Scot and half Welsh, with the sort of views you expect of an Orangeman, though in his case, they're half humorous." Orangemen, by the way, were members of a Protestant political party in Northern Ireland. What we see from this letter, though, is that the desire for Lewis to be Catholic, or even the assumption that he was in fact Catholic, was alive and well in his day. Some Catholics today are still confused by his Anglicanism, and I've even heard people claim that the only reason he didn't become Catholic was that he just didn't live long enough to do so. Look, I'm just going to be honest with you guys for a second. I find this particular line of argument just a bit annoying, and I've heard it applied not only to Lewis, but to others as well, like Søren Kierkegaard, the great Danish existentialist. There is a small group of people who seem to think that to enjoy a writer, you must assume that they either were secretly Catholic, like Shakespeare apparently, or they were on their way to being Catholic, like Lewis and others, when in reality, it's just like perfectly plausible that someone could have great insights about the Christian life while consciously choosing to make their home in a different Christian denomination. In this video, I want to take a brief look at why it was that C.S. Lewis didn't become Catholic, not only so that we can better understand him as an individual, but as usual, I think Lewis is able to shed interesting light on this topic. And by the way, if you enjoy videos like this, consider supporting the channel. You can do that by becoming a patron, booking a meeting with me to chat about theology, or simply hitting subscribe to help the channel keep reaching more people. Although Lewis much preferred to talk about the things Christians agree about than the things they disagree about, he did leave us a few writings that indicate what kept him from crossing the Tiber. Perhaps the best insight into this comes from a short essay of his that goes by the title Christian Reunion. This little essay has a really fascinating backstory. It was discovered written on the back of some papers that contained on the other side his broadcasts on Mere Christianity that he did on the radio in the 1940s. The essay was published only after he died, well after he died in the 1990s, and it's the only piece of his writing that we have that specifically covers Anglican-Catholic relations. It's definitely worth reading, and I'll link to it below. But in it, we find a few really interesting points. The first is that Lewis really isn't all that optimistic that reunion will occur. He thinks that we're better learning to live amidst our disunity than holding our breath for it to be fixed. He begins the essay by writing this: I have been asked to write on Christian reunion, but I am afraid that what I have to say will amount to little more than a rough analysis of the actual disunity and a suggestion as to how most of us ought to behave while our tragic and sinful divisions continue. Why is this, though? Lewis argues that for much of history, Protestant Catholic divisions were tied up as much in theology as in politics, class, and nationality. By the 1940s, though, he believed that the issues were more acutely theological rather than political or even liturgical, for that matter. In fact, in a rather clever turn of phrase, he writes, in southern England, the Romans are now not ritualistic enough to please the high Anglicans, and Congregationalists may, I am told, be as high as either. Whatever the barrier now is, it is no longer a barrier of candles. Whatever the fog, it is not a fog of incense. I mean, he's just a fun person to read. But so what is the barrier? Well, for Lewis, it's all about authority. He writes, the real reason, I take it, why you cannot be in communion with us, meaning Protestants, is not your disagreement with this or that particular Protestant doctrine, so much as the absence of any real doctrine, in your sense of the word, at all. It is, you feel, like asking a man to say he agrees not with a speaker, but with a debating society. And the real reason why I cannot be in communion with you is not my disagreement with this or that Roman doctrine, but that to accept your church means not to accept a given body of doctrine, but to accept in advance any doctrine your church hereafter produces. It is like being asked to agree not only to what a man has said, but to what he's going to say. So, for the Catholic, Protestant doctrine, it's just too flexible. It's too poorly defined. But for Lewis, the problem with Catholicism is really infallibility. But rather than arguing against Catholicism on the basis that it has erred, he seems to take issue with the notion that he's being asked to trust that it won't err in the future. This seems to indicate that Christian doctrines are meant to be the type of thing that are accepted only after examination on the basis of arguments, rather than in advance based on authority. However, it is important to keep in mind that other letters of Lewis reveal that he did take issue with certain doctrines that had already been proposed by the Catholic Church. In addition to papal infallibility, two particular teachings pop up in a few places. They are doctrines related to Mary and transubstantiation. He summarizes this well in a 1945 letter to Lyman Stebbins, in which he writes, the Roman Church, where it differs from this universal tradition, and especially from the apostolic Christianity, I reject. Thus, their theology about the Blessed Virgin Mary, I reject because it seems utterly foreign to the New Testament, where indeed the words, blessed is the womb that bore thee, receive a rejoinder pointing in exactly the opposite direction. Their papalism seems equally foreign to the attitude of St. Paul towards St. Peter in the epistles. The doctrine of transubstantiation insists in defining in a way what the New Testament seems to me not to countenance. In a word, the whole setup of modern Romanism seems to me to be as much a provincial or local variation from the central ancient tradition as any particular Protestant sect is. In other words, Lewis makes the classic Protestant claim that the problem with Roman Catholic teaching is that it's simply not Catholic enough. Of course, I suspect that Lewis, committed as he was to the Anglican Church, might be a bit annoyed that a video such as this exists. After all, as we already said, he wasn't really fond of dwelling on disagreements. So, in the spirit of our good friend Clive, I think it's helpful to end this video where he ended the essay that I mentioned earlier. While he started that with not being optimistic about unity, he did have an interesting theory on how it would come about if it ever did. Lewis didn't believe this would happen by the people on the fringes of their tradition blurring the boundaries between the two. In other words, Canterbury and Rome wouldn't be united by the most Catholic Anglicans and the most Anglican Catholics finding unity. Instead, Lewis thought the real path to unity was by faithfully embodying the center of your own tradition. I think this is really wise, because in being faithful to one's own tradition, they are showing that they believe doctrine truly matters. There was a priest who had a great influence on me. It was the priest whose church I first visited back in Chicago, where I toured it at St. John Cantius. And he once said to me that he too saw unity coming about not because Catholics and Protestants would blend their beliefs, but rather in a world where increasingly people see faith as optional, committed Catholics and committed Protestants would see a sameness of spirit in one another, even if they had doctrinal disagreements. Now, neither this priest, nor Lewis, nor I, for that matter, intend to say that doctrine doesn't matter. But I do believe that there's more that unites us in Christ than divides us in doctrinal particularities. Perhaps the greatest efforts for unity are simply being deeply committed Christians right where we are and learning to see in our brothers and sisters in different communities that same spirit dwelling in them and in us. And it's one of my great hopes in this channel in bringing together guests from across the Christian tradition that despite the doctrinal disagreements, you would see Christ in all of them, and perhaps in that experience might be able to see the church come together just a little bit more.